Ashley, and today I'm painting a loose watercolor seahorse on a watercolor canvas. So this is a time-lapse video where I'll discuss some of the techniques that I use, but also some challenges that I had with this painting. I'll preface this with saying that it's pretty important to get to know your materials to determine what techniques are going to work best for those materials for a painting. So if I were to do this again on this same type of canvas, I would definitely make some slightly different choices. So first, this part went fine. I start with just a basic outline of the seahorse in a light wash of yellow, and then I pretty much just fill it in with that light wash of yellow. I did do the face of the seahorse last on this kind of watercolor sketch because that was the most complex part, and it was also the part that I needed to get like the angle of his tilting down nose and the length of his nose correct. So doing it last allowed me to see the proportions a little bit better. I also didn't want to sketch this out with pencil first because it allowed me to be looser and freer with the painting. And it's just a little bit more impressionistic. So after getting that basic shape in, I add just a small amount of some bright orange color to the back of the seahorse. And this just adds a little bit of shading, kind of gets a sense of the light coming from the front of the seahorse, and then the back would be in shadows. It also adds kind of a barrier to where I put this fin in on the seahorse's back. From there, I started adding some layers of yellows and oranges just to build up a little bit of intensity in the seahorse and define kind of some of the shadow areas. So I kind of define where his jaw meets his neck, and then I start to add just a little bit more shadow to some areas. Also here is a step that I would change if I were to do it again. So I started to add some kind of texture marks to interpret the ridges that are on the back of the seahorse. So I add in some like oranges and reds and just build up the intensity there, but focusing on those kind of like detailed shadow areas that the ridges would create. So the problem with doing this right now on this specific surface is that this watercolor canvas allows for really, really easy like lifting and reactivation of the paint. So the paint doesn't seep in as much or stain the surface. It kind of sits on top. So even after it's dried, just adding a little bit of water reactivates that paint. And then it kind of allows you to blend the layers together even after they're dry, which if you want a more blended look, that's fantastic. But if you're going for glazing, which is where you add like thin, light layers of paint, very transparent layers of paint on the top, allowing some details from underneath to show, then it doesn't work, because as soon as you add that wash, even if you're not scrubbing or doing a lot of brush strokes, it just lifts that paint up. So I definitely would do this different here, but I like the look of the ridges that I created here. It adds some interesting texture. I also added the little half circle eye at this stage, which was just dumb. I know better than that. I should not have added that dark gray to the painting at this stage, knowing that I'm going to add more layers, because later then I have to like work around the eye, which it works out fine, but it'd be a lot easier to just add that eye last. So definitely don't get ahead of yourself here. Wait on some of these details till later, even if you're working in glazing. Wasn't worth adding there. For the background, I start with a medium wash of Prussian blue. So I start with kind of cutting the background in around the small areas of the seahorse's face and getting it nice and close to his belly there. And then I drop in some darker, like thicker, less watered down pigment to create a shadow kind of under his jaw and chin and around his belly, just to create that cast shadow. And because I know that I'm working toward a dark background here, I don't have to worry about starting with a really light wash. Typically you want to work in lighter to darker with watercolor, but because I'm going really dark, I can start with this pretty strong medium wash and not have to do a ton of layers to build up that color. So knowing kind of what your target is at the end, what you want, can help you work a little bit more efficiently. So in addition to kind of washing in that paint, I do add some clean water in areas to create some cauliflower edges. This just adds interesting variation and texture to kind of simulate the movement of the water. There are quite a few different techniques to add texture. Let me know what your favorite technique for adding texture is in the comments, and maybe I'll try it if I haven't yet. But we can just kind of start a conversation about texture in watercolor there. On the left side of the Seahorse, I add a little bit more intense pigment to start with, because I know that, again, that's going to be my shadow side of the Seahorse. The back of the Seahorse is darker, so then behind the Seahorse will also be darker in the water. So I add a little bit stronger pigment, and then I just drop in some of the pigment as well. Just kind of dot it in. It's very wet on wet here, so it's gonna bleed out and spread, and it's not gonna leave little dots, but it just creates another kind of layer of texture doing that wet on wet, like dropping in of dark colors. I also add some splatters of both clean water and darker pigment here too. So some areas of the background are more dry and some are more wet, so some get washed out more. I do add a little bit of clean water to blend out some of the areas where I didn't want as distinct of splatters, but some of them I left as well. I did try to avoid getting the splatters on the Seahorse, but you can see that some spots did get onto him, and this is where that lifting ability of this canvas comes in handy, because I can just use a clean, very minimally damp brush and basically touch that spot and it lifts right up. Because this canvas lifts so easy, it does make it easier to correct things like these errant splatters. So after getting that background to a stage where I'm happy with it, I like the intensity, I start to work on adding more intensity to the Seahorse, because now the Seahorse looks pretty washed out there. So I just start by adding some kind of glazes of color to both the body and kind of the back of the Seahorse. And you'll see here where I take the brush and just do one brush stroke. I'm not scrubbing or doing tons of brush strokes on the back, but immediately you'll start to see that the ridges that I had painted before start to bleed. And that is not typical if you're painting on like a watercolor paper, a high quality paper. That glaze shouldn't make it bleed like that, but because the paint sits more on top of this canvas, it starts reactivating really quickly. So at that point, because I knew that it was starting to get washed out, I just decided to keep going with my layers and building up the intensity, knowing that it was going to blend out. And then later I come in after I've built that intensity to add some of those texture marks. So I do get a little bit impatient and I start to add those darker textured marks wet on wet, which I know is going to make it bleed out and I'm not going to get any definition there. So I had to stop and pause, take a breath, walk away, let it dry before I add those textured marks. So then when it's actually dry, I add the texture marks now for a third time. Again, not the most efficient way to work on this painting, but I did add them to get that definition that I wanted. So make sure, couple things, you're patient with your paintings, know when to pause, step back. If you want nice crisp edges, you have to let it dry first. Don't let impatience get you ahead of yourself, because then you're just going to have to redo those steps anyway. And get to know your materials. So this was just the second painting I did on one of these canvases. The first one I didn't have a lot of layering, so I didn't notice as much how easily it lifted with that first painting. So I'm still very happy with the results, but again, I'd probably approach it a little bit differently if I were to do this again on the same surface. So I hope you learned something like I did in the process of this painting. Thank you so much for watching today and have an awesome day.